Good evening and welcome to Spiritual Story Time. I'm Domo Geshe, and tonight we begin a new book which I've been really looking forward to. This is called Stories of God. It's by Rainer Maria Rilke, and I'm sure that most everyone is aware of Rilke, and quite an illuminated being that people have said for a long time. This book was written in 1904, and he had such an interesting way of looking at life that I hope we're still on. Anyway, when Condro comes back, there's a kind of an orange band at the top, and now it's a green band. I hope we're actually on. Now it's gone. So I assume we're back. We're either back or we didn't leave. Anyway, so Stories of God. This is a book that I have read part of, but not the whole thing. But this is one of my favorite books, and I'd like to begin by reading the dedication, written by Rilke in Rome, April 1904. And it says, "My friend, I once gave this book into your hands, and you cared for it as no one has yet done. So I have grown accustomed to think that it belongs to you. Suffer me, therefore, not only in your own book, but in all the books of this new edition, to write your name, to write, 'The Stories of God belong to Ellen Key.'" Isn't that sweet? So, just to give us a flavor of what Rilke was like, so that when we begin the stories, which we will have time for, one of his stories this evening also. This is the translator's notes. "These youthful fantasies were almost entirely improvised out of an instinct which, if I were to specify it more particularly, I might describe as busied with transferring God from the sphere of rumor into the realm of direct and daily experiencing, the recommending by every means a naive and lively talking into use of God with which I seem to have been charged since childhood." This is in Rilke's words. Now this is the translator. "Beyond this, written 20 years later by a poet who disliked attempting to explain how he had come to write a particular work, and usually fell back on the idea of some subconscious or automatic dictation, we know little of the genesis of the Stories of God. None of the manuscript material has survived. They obviously came after Rilke's first Munich days, his early experiences of Italy, and his first Russian journey in the spring of 1899. According to other statements of his own, Rilke was fond of this book, the 13 tales of which he had written down in a manner so characteristic of his workings, at a happy moment somewhere between the 10th and the 21st of November, 1899, in the course of 7 consecutive nights." Maybe, isn't there something like the 7 veils of the 7 nights? Anyway, 7 nights he wrote this. "It first appeared just before Christmas, 1900, but under a different title. The roundabout approach," which is German, "the roundabout approach implied in the subtitle was meant to cover the embarrassment he always sensed on talking with children, to which he refers to in the introductory tale. Though he felt how truly the wide and real world belongs to the young youth, this constraint made spontaneous communication impossible, so that only by some such device as this could he reach those who he knew would understand him if he tried to say something about God. The little artifice, thus charmingly accounted for, remains an ingredient of the storytelling. But when in the following year Insel Verlag brought out a second impression of the book, it was under the present title. In 1904, the publishers expressed a wish to scrap the old format, which Rilke never liked, unhandy and unpretty, in favor of a simpler and more attractive volume. For this, properly speaking, second edition, he revised da-da-da-da-da-da-da, At Rilke's own request, his friend and admirer, Ellen Key, a Swedish feminist, had prepared a brief foreword for it. And so on, and so on. In its second edition, in its second form, 1904, this book has never been out of print. It went through 12 impressions in Rilke's lifetime and has been translated into various languages besides English: French, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, Swedish, Polish, and Czechish. Okay. The present English translation, a revision of its predecessor, is in the groundworking of which the translator da-da-da-da-da-da. Even by his own more mature standards, this text represents pre-pose. What happens when it's a green? Is that flickering on and off? It went on and then it went off. It's not there now, so there's nothing to see.
I don't know.
Okay, anyway, we go on. I hope we're continuing. Even by his own more mature standards, this text represents pre-pose. It is such a characteristic Rilke that in the light of experience, the translation has deserved revision in considerable detail. The mode of expression in itself, not unique for the period in any literature, or a purpose slightly stilted at times, with its touches of humor, of irony, its stylized whimsy, its biblical turns to rouse an echo of familiar phraseology, must still be kept quite as much as the poetic qualities of concept and description, which are the distinguishing features of a great artist's accomplishment. Translating Rilke means translating not only German, and to begin with, we have no satisfactory way of rendering von lieben Gott, but Rilke's very individual German. He sometimes uses odd words. More often, he uses words oddly. Sometimes he invents words, a process which goes better in German than in English. 9 times out of 10, one discovers an acuteness of observation and intent in his particular employment of a tense, an adjective, an adverb, a preposition. These items are easily overlooked in the mechanics of translation. One must be constantly on guard, balancing between too literal adherence to an unusual expression and the expected commonplace, at all costs avoiding indifference to genuine distinctions. Autobiographical elements will naturally be recognized in the writings by anyone at all familiar with Rilke's works, letters and early diaries. Here and there, touches of local color in implied references to customs and conventions of his own young days also occur as part of the background. Whether Rilke's allusions to Renaissance history and art show a thoroughly disciplined knowledge or not, whether, as has been suggested, his fascination with Russia sprang largely from what he himself felt and wanted to recognize in it, whether for all his love and enthusiasm for the country, he makes some mistakes in his Russian or mixes up his heroes or interprets folk tales in his own way. These points are not in question here. They have been ably dealt with elsewhere. This book of stories is the youthful work of a great poet. It should be read and enjoyed alone with itself. Broadcast interrupting. Okay, sorry, I think it's kind of going in and out just a little bit, so I'll continue, but we'll be posting the entire video. I've got a heart there. Thank you for someone sending me a heart. Are you going to send me a hug? They've got new hug things today, like that. This makes me think of how difficult it is to translate any language into a meaningful translation for other languages which are spoken by a culture which is very different, particularly Tibetan culture coming into American or even Indian culture going to Tibet long ago. So I appreciate the work of translators, and particularly I appreciate how much my work, a great deal of my work, has been translated either verbally or also in the written form into German. And for that, I thank my wonderful translators, and also sometimes French, Italian, like that. So. The first story is the tale of the hands of God. Recently, one morning, I met the lady who lives next door. We exchanged greetings. "What an autumn," she exclaimed after a pause, and looked up at the sky. I did the same. The morning was indeed very clear and exquisite for October. Suddenly I had an idea. "What an autumn!" I cried, waving about a little with my hands. And my neighbor nodded in assent. I watched her thus for a moment. Her good, healthy face bobbed up and down so amiably. It was very bright. Only around the lips and at the temples there were little shadowy wrinkles. How could she have gotten them? And then I asked, all unexpectedly, "And your little girls?" The wrinkles in her face vanished for a second, but gathered again at once, darker than before. "Well, thank God, but—" My neighbor began to walk on, and I now strode along at her side, as it is proper. "You know, they have both reached the age, those children, when they ask all day long." "What? All day long? And right straight into the night?" "Yes," I murmured, "there is a time." But she took no notice. And not just such questions as, "Where does this horse car go? How many stars are there? And is 10,000 more than many?" Quite different things as well. For example, does God speak Chinese also? And what does God look like? Always everything about God. But that's something we ourselves don't know about. "No, of course," I agreed. "But we can have our guesses." Or about God's hands. What is one to... I looked at my neighbor full in the face. "Pardon me," I said most politely. "You just said the hands of God. Did you not?" She nodded. I think she was a little surprised. "Well," I hastened to add, I happen to know something about those hands. By chance," I remarked quickly as I saw her eyes grow round. "Quite by chance. I finished with considerable decision. I will tell you what I know. If you have a moment, I will accompany you to your house. That will just give me time." "Gladly," said she, when I at last let her speak, still much astonished. "But wouldn't you like to tell the children myself? No, no, dear lady, that wouldn't do. That wouldn't do at all. You see, I promptly get embarrassed when I have to talk to children. That itself is not bad, but the children might think I was embarrassed because I felt myself telling lies. And as the veracity of my story is very important to me, why, you can repeat it to the children. You will surely do it much better. You can put it together and embellish it. I will just give you the simple facts in the shortest form. Shall I? Very well, said my neighbor absently. I reflected. In the beginning. But I broke off at once. I may assume that you, my dear neighbor, already know many things that I would first have to tell the children, for example, about the creation. There was a considerable pause. Yes, and on the seventh day, the good woman's voice was high and sharp. Stop, I cried. We must think of the earlier days too, for indeed it is they that concern us. Well, God, as we know, began his work by making the earth, distinguishing it from the waters, and the decreeing light. Then he fashioned with amazing rapidity things. I mean, the really big things that are rocks, mountains, a tree, and after this pattern, many trees. Now I had for some time been hearing footsteps behind us, which neither caught up to us nor fell back. That bothered me, and I became entangled in my story of the creation as I went on in the following manner. One can only arrive at an understanding of this swift and fruitful activity if one assumes that after a long and deep reflection, everything must have been already in his head before now at last the footsteps were beside me, and a not exactly pleasant voice fastened itself upon us. Oh, surely you are speaking of Herr Schmidt. Pardon me. I looked at the newcomer with annoyance, but my companion became very much embarrassed. She coughed. No, that is, yes, we were just speaking, in a way. What an autumn, said the other woman suddenly, as though nothing had happened, and her red little face beamed. Yes, I heard my neighbor reply. You are right, Frau Hupfer, an exceptionally fine autumn. Then the ladies parted. Frau Hupfer tittered on. And give the little children my love. My good neighbor took no more notice. Of course, she was curious to hear my story. I, however, declared with an incomprehensible asperity, yes, but now I've forgotten where we stopped. You were just saying something about his head, that is, my neighbor turned scarlet. I was truly sorry for her, so I quickly went on. Well, you see, as long as only things were being made, God did not need to look down on the earth continually. Nothing could happen there. The wind was, indeed, already moving among the mountains, which were so like the clouds it had long known, but it still shunned the trees with a certain mistrust. And that was quite right with God. Things he had fashioned, so to speak, in his sleep. And only when he came to the animals did the work really begin to interest him. He bent over it, and only seldom raised his broad brows to cast a glance down at earth. He forgot completely when he began to create man. I don't know which complicated part of the body he arrived at, when there was a rush of wings above him. An angel hurried by, singing, Thou who seest all. God startled. He had caused that angel to sin, for it was a lie he had just sung. Quickly, God the Father peered down, and sure enough, something had already happened that was hardly to be remedied. A little bird was fluttering hither and yon over the earth, as though it was frightened, and God was in no position to help it home, for he had not seen out of which forest the poor creature had come. He grew very vexed and said, "The birds are to sit still where I put them." But then he remembered that at the request of the angels, he had lent them wings, so that on earth too there would be something like angels, and this circumstance annoyed him even more. Now, in such a state of mind, nothing is so salutary as work. And busied with the construction of man, God quickly grew happy again. He had the eyes of the angels before him as mirrors, measured his own features in them, and was slowly and carefully modeling on a ball in his lap the first face. He had succeeded with the forehead, and much more difficult for him was making the two nostrils symmetrical. He bent lower and lower over the work, till a wind passed over him again. He looked up. The same angel was circling around him, and no hymn was to be heard at this time, for with his lie the boy's voice had been extinguished, but God could see by his mouth that he was still singing, "Thou who seest all." At that moment, St. Nicholas, who stands especially high in God's esteem, came up to him and said through his big beard, "Your lions are sitting quite still, and very haughty beasts they are, I must say. But a little dog is running round on the very edge of the world, a terrier. See, he'll be falling off in a moment." And indeed, God noticed a little bright speck, white like a tiny light, dancing about in the neighborhood of Scandinavia, where the earth is already so fearfully round. And he was exceedingly angry and reproachfully told St. Nicholas if he didn't like his lions, he should try and make some himself. Whereas St. Nicholas walked out of heaven and slammed the door so hard that a star fell down right on the terrier's head. Now the mischief was done, and God had to admit to himself that it was all his own fault. And he determined not to take his eyes off the earth anymore. And so it was. He left the work to his hands, which of course are wise themselves. And although he was extremely curious to find out what man might look like, he continued to gaze fixedly down at the earth, where now, as if out of spite, not a leaflet would stir. To have at least some little pleasure after all this trouble, he had bidden his hands to show him man first before they should deliver him over to life. Repeatedly he asked, as children ask when they play hide and seek, "Ready?" But for answer he heard the kneading of his hands, and he waited. It seemed like a very long time to him. Then suddenly he saw something falling through space, something dark and in a direction that made it seem to come from quite near him. Filled with evil foreboding, he called to his hands. They appeared all blotchy with clay, hot and trembling. "Where is man?" God thundered at them. The right hand flew at the left. "You dropped him." "Excuse me," countered the left, provoked. You insisted on doing everything yourself. You wouldn't even let me have anything to say. But you ought to have held him." And the right hand drew back as if to strike, but then thought better of it. And the two raced each other in saying, he was so impatient, man. He was in such a hurry to live. It's not our fault, really. We are both innocent. But God was seriously angry. He pushed both hands away, for they blocked the earth from his sight. "I've finished with you from now on. Go and do as you like." And that is what his hands have been trying to do ever since. But whatever they start, they can only begin. Without God, there is no perfection. And so at last they tired of it. Now they are on their knees all day long, doing penance. At least so it is said. To us, however, it appears as though God were resting, because he is angry with his hands. It is still the seventh day. I was silent for a moment. My companion used that moment very sensibly. "And do you think they will never again be reconciled?" "Oh, yes," I said. "At least I hope so." "And when might that be?" "Well, not until God knows what man, whom his hands released against his will, looks like." My neighbor reflected with a laugh and then said with a laugh, "But for all he needed would have been to look down." "Pardon me," I said politely. "Your remark shows acumen, but my story is not yet done." You see, when his hands had got out of the way and God looked over the earth again, another instant, or rather 1,000 years, which is of course the same thing, had gone by. Instead of one man, there were already 1,000,000. But then too, they were all already wearing clothes. And the fashion was very ugly at that time, and even distorted people's faces badly. God received an entirely false, and I will not conceal the fact, a very poor impression of mankind. Said my neighbor, about to make some remark. I took no notice, but concluded with great emphasis. "And that is why it is urgently necessary that God should learn what man is really like. Let us rejoice that there are those who tell him." The good lady was not yet rejoicing. "And who might they be, if you please?" "Simply the children, and now and again, too, the people who paint, write poems, build what? Churches? Yes, and other things too, build in general." My neighbor slowly shook her head. Parts of my story seemed to her very remarkable. We had already gone past her house, and now turned slowly about. Suddenly she exclaimed with a merry laugh, "But what nonsense! For of course God is omniscient. He must have known, for example, exactly where the little bird had come from." She looked at me triumphantly. I was rather taken aback, I must confess. But when I had recovered my composure, I managed a perfectly serious expression. "My dear lady," I informed her, "that is really a story in itself. But lest you think this merely an excuse on my part," naturally she now protested warmly, "I will briefly explain. God has all the attributes, of course, But before he was in a position to exercise them, as it were, upon the world, they all seemed to him like a single great force. I don't know whether I make myself clear. But in confronting things, his faculties become specialized and turn to a certain degree into duties. He had difficulty remembering everything. There are always conflicts. Incidentally, all this I am telling to you alone, and you must on no account retell it to the children. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it, my listener declared. You see, if an angel had flown by him singing, "Thou who knowest all," everything would have come out right. And there would have been no need for this story? Exactly, I confirmed. And I prepared to take my leave. But are you absolutely certain about all this? I am absolutely certain, I replied almost solemnly. Then I shall have plenty to tell the children today. I should love to be able to listen. Goodbye. Goodbye, answered my neighbor. Then she turned back again. But why did that particular angel? My dear neighbor, I said, interrupting her, I now see that your two little girls ask so many questions, not at all because they are children. But, as she asked inquisitively, well, the doctors say there are certainly hereditary traits. My neighbor shook her finger at me, but we nevertheless parted the best of friends. What a great story. I had so much fun telling that. I hope the others are like this. Stories of God. This little book was originally $1.25 when it was purchased. So this book has been going around for a long time. It's got some stains on the top, but I'm so happy to have it. I love this man, and I bless him and wish him well, whatever incarnation he might be in now. Maybe he's, I don't know, maybe he's Obama. What do you think? Such a way with words. May my capacity for compassion be infinite. I dedicate these efforts to complete and total enlightenment, so that I may be of benefit to all sentient beings. May it be so. Good night, rest well. See you tomorrow night. We continue with Rilke.